Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure we're very full from our lunches now, so you can go to sleep if you want. I'm just kidding. So welcome to this panel. David versus Goliath is a story that really resonates with me, being in this space for more than 5 years. Luckily, the David now is a little bit bigger, not just a baby, it's a toddler now, and obviously the Goliath's now entertaining the toddler a bit more. So definitely a lot of things have changed since 5 years ago, from saying about Bitcoin to making Bitcoin invisible, and then now blockchain, and then we have cryptocurrency coming back up again, and then now we have, for the likes of Facebook, doing their own cryptocurrency as well. So we have a very esteemed panel here. So let's just have them introduce themselves first before we continue discussing more on this topic.
Hi everyone, my name is Stephen Pu. I'm the founder of the Terraxer project. It's great to be here.
Good evening, good afternoon everybody. My name is Soeren Duvier. I'm a managing partner at Ætler, an advisory consulting company.
Hi everyone, I'm Daphne, the CEO of JEDTrade and also the Secretary General of Assaf with Anson.
Hey everyone, my name is Assaf. I'm the CEO of Anqlave.
Oh, I haven't introduced myself. Yes, I'm the chair of Access, a Singapore blockchain association here. We have over 300 odd members, 200 of them are all companies, and many of the big names, PwC, Deloitte, Binance, Huobi, and basically a wide range of companies that are dealing with both crypto and blockchain. Okay, so let's deep dive a little bit into the topic. I'm sure most of us have worked on projects with enterprises, ones that may not have been in blockchain and then started looking into it. And then we, as startups, we then have to speak to them. What are your experiences from the beginning, or what have things changed, and what are interesting things that you've seen? Anyway, like your experiences working with enterprises.
So I guess at the very beginning, I mean, I like to draw a lot of parallels with sort of at the beginning of the internet, right? So in the early 90s, nobody knew what a website is, but a couple of friends and I, we started a company to convince everyone that although you don't know what a website is, you definitely need one, right? So we help a lot of companies to do it. And then slowly, more people sort of start getting a better understanding of what this technology was, and they had, in-house expertise, and now they're starting to iterate on some of this stuff. And then, of course, today we have, a very rich ecosystem of, different people who architect, who consult, who provide cloud services, hardware, software, just very finely divided ecosystem. So I think at blockchain, we're sort of past the stage where you go to a company and say, hey, guess what? There's this thing called blockchain. You never heard of it. I know everything about it. I think we're past that stage already. That's probably, 2 years ago, you could go into a company and probably say something like that, and they would, that would probably be the case. And at that time, I think it's more about, giving people sort of lectures and holding workshops and helping people ideate what they could do and building very simple prototypes, right? So today, I think the landscape has shifted, has evolved, right? I think most corporate clients now have some idea about what blockchain is. It's likely that they have done a POC or has heard some lectures before. Some of them even have some sort of in-house POC or solution already in place. So today, I think if you show up at an enterprise, you need to be able to pretty clearly articulate your value, your differentiation, and exactly why they should be working with you. Right? So.
Okay, I can admit about Anqlave. So basically at Anqlave, our focus is more on the data privacy and data security, and as part of it, we build a component or a product that allows enterprises to actually build application on top of a sort of blockchain system, but still preserve the data privacy and data security. So I think when we spoke about the relationship between startup and enterprise, I think that for every startup, regardless of the industry, he always try to find at least 1 or 2 enterprise partner to start a business. Because when you start your startup, so you have an idea, an amazing idea that can solve some sort of problems, but you really need to find the right player in the industry that will give you the confidence that your product can really disrupt the industry. So in the sense of the blockchain, what we experienced in the last 12 months is that there's a lot of enterprises that wants to adopt blockchain, and they don't really know how to do that. And they have two options. They can go to the big players and invest, I would say, quite major amount of money, or they can go to startups and, it really depends. I mean, we heard previously Peter of SGX, and he said that what happens if, who should I blame if something happens, right? So it's always easier to blame enterprise rather than to blame a startup. So if you build your system and then something happened, it's always easier to go to enterprise as a vendor and claim that, you know, they did the fault regarding, if you go to a startup and then you don't have anyone to blame, right? So it's very hard to really connect with enterprise partner when you are a startup.
Okay, so I always find Singapore companies very, very interesting, especially this ecosystem. When working with startups, we always have to find, the main question they will always ask as enterprises is, so when things go wrong, who do we blame? This is the main thing, right? And then the other thing that I want to lead to is, I remember joining a hackathon. I won't mention which bank was under. So we did a solution to the problem that was asked. And then one of the bankers came to me and said, Anson, are you not worried we will copy your solution? So do you guys have that experience by, if you work with an enterprise long enough, you educate them long enough that they may have something running against you?
Okay, I'll just answer that a bit. For JED itself, we have been in the enterprise blockchain space since 2016. So we have actually wrote through, you know, the points of, you know, having to start from education and awareness, where the enterprises ask us, what is it about in terms of the academic part of it. And then we went into 2017, 2018, and then we saw the change in terms of bigger enterprises looking at specific applications of it. And we, as a company, we actually focus on data and financial services, which also includes supply chain. But what we've actually found out throughout this journey, in terms of really identifying the specific blockchain proposition, and it could actually be a small part of the entire vision or mission that they want to actually deploy this new technology, is that they still require a lot of assistance and brainstorming in terms of how to architect it, how it can actually be aligned with their existing systems, or how it actually makes sense to the entire process. So this is based on experience in terms of, we don't really have, that problem so much about that. But what's interesting is that because a lot of our projects, 70% are in ASEAN. And then that's where when we go to ASEAN, and because we are servicing many mainstream enterprises, not so much of like your smart city projects and things like that, which is a much easier sell for us, like for some of our clients. But for the mainstream enterprise customers in the logistics space or even in the financial space, they are actually also a bit like 2 years back or 1.5 years back in terms of needing a lot of insights into which part of the organization they should actually apply this for. Yeah, so this is what we have experienced so far as a team. Yeah.
So yes, the story about educating mainstream, definitely I'm pretty sure the ecosystem has done a pretty good job. As we have heard that Facebook is now working on their own token so that they can pay their employees. So like Facebook was once a startup and now become mainstream. So do you think the story is still telling the enterprises that it is just blockchain and not cryptocurrency, and then we're separating the both, or we should be actually telling that there is a need to understand why both are as important? Or do you think there are some use cases that actually still don't need to have the both together?
I can touch upon that from a supply chain perspective. That's where my company is advising companies, and we actually worked with a company last year, and they are no longer around, but they tried to tokenize the delivery by trucking around Southeast Asia. It was called Open Port, and they felt it was imperative to combine the two. I don't see that happening in, for instance, one of the major projects is, we talked about it earlier today, IBM and Maersk. They have a joint venture or consortia called TradeLens now, with MSC and CMA also having signed up there. So far it's only been press releases, and it's very hard to find out exactly what they're aiming at. But it's some of the things that Daphne described earlier, maybe a little bit about the letter of credit, bill of lading, track and trace, and other things. But so far there hasn't been much coming out of that yet. That's
from our prospect, I mean, we are looking on projects that really have some problem to solve. We got some customers that come into our office and said, okay, we want to deploy this blockchain project. So we always try to sit with them and really find and articulate the problem that you are trying to solve. And if we find that there is a real problem, then we will be there and we will help them and we will build a platform to support them. But if, you know, because we had, from our experience, we had a couple of customers that wanted to build a blockchain POC system, did some PR, and then it didn't end with like a real project. So we are really trying to find what is the problem and then try to solve it using the blockchain components.
Yeah, but I think one of the interesting trend we would see at the end of 2019 and 2020 is the strong vertical relating to STOs and digital assets. And this relates to assetization of, for example, real estate or SME kind of equity crowdfunding or funding mechanism. And in relation to that, I think it would actually be very interesting to look at how we are able to marry both technology as well as the assetization of value, but within a licensed or regulated framework. So I think this is something that would actually be more of an important consideration than so much of a demarcation between having tokens as a form of investment or speculation, or tokens as a form of gas. Yeah.
Okay. This is a great segue to the next topic I want to discuss about, which is regulation. Now, at least from experience, when talking to enterprises in the banking or in the financial sector, they always are worried about compliance and regulation and not getting in trouble with their own regulators. But at the same time, I'm also seeing that they want to comply, but yet not understanding fully how the crypto space actually works. So when you explain to them, do you think with your peers around your startups or that you see, are startups equipped enough still today to actually answer all these questions of compliance to enterprise? Or the other way, you've seen enterprises, they think they know compliance, or do they actually really know it? Like, have you guys had experience talking about regulation, and do you think the startup system is actually quite equipped or not?
I can address some of that. So, I mean, large companies, every single large company I've encountered, they're all extremely risk averse, right? I mean, they have huge ongoing business going on. They don't want to risk any of that. So, as with anything blockchain related, the goal for us to, if we're working with large companies, is you always hide or diminish all the complexities, right? Whether they're technological complexities or regulatory complexities away from these partners, because they don't need to see that, right? As long as you solve their problem, they don't need to see that. The question often came up sort of like, hey, can I hold tokens, right? Is this legal? How does this work in accounting? There are no gap rules for these tokens, all these sort of issues. Well, maybe you don't need to hold tokens. Maybe all you need is pay me some kind of a service fee, and I'll just make sure that whatever your wallet or your node and whatever client you're running is funded, right? And this entity probably is an offshore entity that in a jurisdiction where companies holding tokens is not really an issue, right? So these are sort of the business tactics that you can actually take to make sure that your clients are they don't need to deal with the complexity.
Right? Okay. All right. So yeah. So regulation is definitely very big, and within Access, we're working with many associations dealing with the new rules that are coming out from the Financial Action Task Force, which affects a lot of central banks. So definitely do watch out for that space. It affects from enterprises as well as startups. So from a use case standpoint, we have seen on the news a lot of news that a big company has worked with a startup on a POC. but after that, we don't really see any follow-ups on how it's going on those news announcements. Do we see, from your experience or what you're seeing, do you see any real ones that are actually working properly in production, or are we going to see it sometime in the future?
I'd like to reply a little bit on that again, because we saw it a few hours ago here with Emily Parker asking a little bit similar question to the panel, and people came up with some of the press releases and maybe one specific case as far as I remember. So for supply chain and logistics and transportation space, at the moment the only thing that I'm familiar with that's running is Cathay Pacific's point system. Nothing else. Lots of attempts, and as Emily Parker put it, looking at the supply chain, it looks ripe for disruption, but it's very, very complex. It's a lot of regulations, cross-country. It's about modifying a probably 3,000-4,000 year old system with a bill of lading and a letter of credit, and it's not easy. And that's also what some of the POCs that Accenture has done and Maersk IBM has done shows that there are a lack of standards, there's a lack of regulation, and it's your previous question on that. Well, it's hard to regulate when the business guys don't know what they want, right? So,
I can just add to that you know, companies like Corda, IBM, Microsoft, Accenture, they can do tens of POCs every year and nothing will happen. But for startups, it's very hard. You cannot support, like, you know, any POC opportunity that you have, and, you know, nothing will happen. So you need to choose it very carefully, what kind of POC you want to build, and if you believe that there will be product out of it eventually.
Okay. So you're seeing the insights from POCs. Is it afterwards there's no follow-up, no continuation? Is it because the regulation is confusing as the main point, or they just don't see the cost cutting versus the revenue generating from this is good? Like right now, what do you think is the main barrier?
Yeah. So based on our experience working with our enterprise customers, I can say it's down to two factors. From the enterprise point of view, why POCs thrive initially is because I have a budget, I want to try something, I'm not sure which department to actually deploy it at. I'm not sure whether this is the right problem statement, so let's start small. And then we try and we call it a POC. From the startup point of view, for very avant-garde kind of tech companies, where the technology is not tested, you know, in terms of scalability, in terms of security, then the startup will say, okay, I want to do a POC as well, together with you, because I want to actually test my technology. So that's why the POC stage actually can actually thrive for like 2.5 years or so. But one thing for sure is this year and next year, we are actually going to see a proliferation of operationalizing a lot of these technologies. Companies looking at putting together useful technologies to operationalize a use case that is meaningful, that makes sense. To give you an example, so one of our flagship blockchain projects is called Jupiter Chain. We are actually doing, for example, for a medical client for financial services. How are we able to actually operationalize it is actually with the consideration of putting together technologies that are able to actually give the proposition for our specific use case in relation to privacy, in relation to scalability, in relation to the customer experience. So I think for the next few months or so, it would be beyond POCs, I hope. And we could actually talk about more meaningful kind of experiments, yeah.
So, okay, yes.
I just want to add a little bit more to that. I mean, I think from my experience, right, most large companies, they don't really understand how to incorporate disruptive innovations, right? Large companies don't handle change very well. So exactly, you know, as Daphne, right, just mentioned that a lot of these companies, they have some budget, they spend it, maybe it's something interesting. Even if it turns out to be something interesting, the organization itself isn't really set up to incorporate it into their company. And on the other hand, you know, most of the blockchain startups, the blockchain innovators at the very beginning of the space, they're mostly pure technologists, right? They're not really also not equipped to deal with sort of this multi-stakeholder negotiation within a large corporation. So on one hand, you have people who are not well equipped to do enterprise sales. On the other hand, the vast majority of companies today in the world are still just beginning to sort of, get a grasp on digitization, much less, much as blockchain. So there is going to be a disconnect, right?
So what are things, because this whole topic is on David and Goliath, it's also about not only competition but collaboration, but just still deep dive a little bit more into the POC space. What do you think can improve on both sides to make the process much quicker than just trying to take the POC money? Sorry for being very blunt on this. Yeah. So what do you see that can improve?
Okay, so I will share more from the point of view of what we do. So under our engineering and project management team, under our CTO, Dr. Ernie Teo, we have a very structured approach when we actually meet clients. In fact, we actually reject a lot of clients that actually don't have a clear proposition because we want to be known in the market for doing things that make sense. So having said that, we don't actually go straight into any partnership model by being a blockchain tech partner from day one. We actually do an entire design workshop with the decision makers, the top management team, including the gatekeepers, the process admin drivers. Looking at the entire design thinking and the entire architecture process before we go into the development stage. So this is what we do. Yeah.
Okay, so one last point before we move on to the discussion on the different acquisitions recently. One last point on that. I'm sure you guys also, when talking to enterprises, there's one guy you will always meet, may not just be from a bank, but also from the supply chain, will be the so-called compliance person. Okay, because every industry will have a compliance. How's your feeling when you talk to them? What motivates them to work with you, and how to overcome the barrier of talking to them? Because why I'm saying this, because when Access meets with the Association of Banks and all of them are heads of compliance, it's like on steroids on trying to move over the wall to talk to them, and it's not easy. So I would like to know from a non-banking perspective, when you talk to them, how is it like?
Okay, I'll just start. I mean, so every single time you do any kind of project, right? There's compliance. There's a lawyer sitting there, and the lawyer's always going to say no to everything because that's his job, right? You just say no to everything. Fundamentally speaking, right? I mean, the guy to, in my opinion, the guy to convince is not really the lawyer. The guy to convince is the top executives who actually see real value, right? Everything is the cost-benefit analysis, right? And are the risks sufficiently low to justify the benefit that's bringing? If that were the case, then the decision makers will find ways to convince the lawyers to make sure that it actually makes sense. If you go one-on-one with the lawyers, that's, in my opinion, that you've already lost, right? Starting from the beginnings.
So for me, I think that we are always trying to balance between the technology people and the business users. And once we manage to balance it, I mean, they can take care of the legal stuff. Right?
I see. So yeah, there's a card game for poker very similar to what you're saying. If in 30 minutes you don't find the fish on your table, you become the fish. Right? So this is very similar for compliance as well. So yes, and then now leading on to M&As, as we've seen many, for the ones that are in ASEAN, we've seen a lot of the big unicorns recently acquiring a lot of the Bitcoin or crypto, blockchain startups, and so on. When you do talk to enterprises, have you come across, or even your peers come across, that instead of actually doing a POC or a project for them, that it makes more sense since they understand what you're doing, they actually buy you over? When you actually encounter this sort of dialogue, do you have this in mind as part of the agenda when talking to enterprises? Some of them.
Not as an acquisition, but as an active partner, maybe active investor.
Cool. Yes, because like Gojek has bought Coins.ph, Facebook bought Chainspace. Do you see this trend continuing, or is they are just because they're so big, they just buy and see if they can acquire more like?
I think generally in deep tech, I mean, if you have good technology and big company want to access this technology, the fastest way will be for them to acquire you, right? So if you have like really good outbreaking technology, so most probably yes.
Okay, cool. All right, so there are a number of questions. Well, a lot more than I see. Okay, so now let's dive into the Slido. I like this question. One of the questions one of the audience asks is, isn't the goal of blockchain to take down greedy intermediaries? So what is the end game?
Yeah, I saw that question. It was actually from the morning.
Oh, it's from the morning.
But it's okay because supply chain springs to mind there also. And one of the areas where Ætler is working is with the Singapore entity IMGA on this trade trust with China. And obviously one of the things and one of the sensitive parts is to make sure that intermediaries are taken care of. Yeah, it's not just about getting rid of the greed. They actually serve a purpose, and they'll probably in many cases continue to serve a purpose in the future.
Okay, so that means we don't have enough questions. Okay, so if there are questions from the floor, please, if we can get the mic. But we have one just for this panel. Why are there so many enterprises choosing to work with blockchain providers like R3 and Consensus, similar to what I asked, instead of acquiring startups? Why do you think it's better to work with these sorts?
Yeah, I think it's relevant to the answer that Peter of SGX mentioned earlier today, right? They want to work with someone they can trust, with someone that will be there for them next year. When they are working with startups, I don't know, 9, 10 people, they don't have any confidence that this startup will be exist next year, right?
Okay. So is it about the money side? Because R3 and Consensus, they have deep pockets. Like, they are also new. They're not from like 2014, 2013 though. So they are still a startup but with deep pockets, right? So
yeah. So for JED, right, we started as a startup. We are still agile like a startup, but all our projects now are with enterprises and even the big boys. So I guess yes, the answer is to establish trust and to actually establish traction, and it takes time. And I don't actually blame the enterprises for actually wanting to actually work with a reliable partner, because it's actually a fundamental kind of principle whether you're a startup or not. Yeah.
I have to add another point to that, and maybe it's related to the Asian culture, because as you can see, I'm not natively from Asia. So I think that over here in Asia, enterprises are less open to adopt startup technologies or startup products. If you compare to the West, I don't know, Steven is from the Valley, so he can tell you about like how enterprises open to work with startup over there.
That would be great. I'll dive into that. So, do you see cultural differences when looking at in the Valley, or comparing to Asia? If you have talked to clients or enterprises, what major differences you see when regarding enterprises?
Yeah, so I think companies in Silicon Valley, obviously, first of all, I think maybe the cultural difference is not as big as sort of the differences between industry verticals, right? So most companies in Silicon Valley are tech companies, right? And they feel very comfortable working with technology. There are startups all around them all the time. They acquire startups, they spin off startups. They're very comfortable with that ecosystem, and they coexist within that ecosystem. So it's that level of comfort in that specific vertical, which is the general vertical of technology, right? We're currently working with an agricultural company that make pesticides. They don't even have like a WeChat account, right? So I've had one of their executives tell me like, can you explain like this internet thing to me? And I'm like, it's okay, that's fine. We'll do that. So different. We have this sort of, we have this sort of mapping, right? At which industries are closest sort of to consumer technology that they become more familiar and more comfortable working with startups and working with technology. For companies that are more traditional, that are closer to manufacturing, whose customers and ecosystems are, like in agriculture, perhaps less educated, well, that's their business. It wasn't really required of them to adopt these new technologies. So yeah, so for for some of these manufacturing-driven companies and verticals, they are going to be sort of a lot more risk-averse, and they are going to be a lot more hesitant about adopting new technologies. Not just blockchain, it's just across the board. So yeah, just for me, I just think that there's a lot more difference across verticals rather than across culture, I think.
So so the segue to communications, I think this is key in order to get a deal done with enterprises. For your experience, when working with enterprises, there must be a lot of levels in order to get to where you need to go. And do you guys see that there is a need for a champion to be inside in order to get a deal done? And if you do, have you had experience where when maybe let's say there's 5 levels you need to get to, and the 3rd level your champion actually leaves the company? And then how do you salvage the deal? Have any tips or any experiences around that?
We definitely have experience with internal champions. Like if you find this guy and he really likes you, it could be very helpful. I don't have the experience of this champion, leaving or disappear at some point. Maybe, maybe we do have. But yeah, it can affect the way you are doing the business with this enterprise.
Okay. I also think we've seen some of these champions. I think we've also seen, and maybe I'm a little bit skeptical, but we have seen this fear of missing out residing a little bit. And some of these champions are getting a little bit more fact-oriented, and some are also suggesting that blockchain has to deliver a few more proven business cases before people will actually start moving ahead. So people don't feel that they're left behind at the moment, is my feeling. So some of the champions are very important, but they're also getting more factually oriented.
Oh, that's good. So that means the management, the ones that so-called FOMO'd in or really understand they need to be in, you don't fully actually need the champion. That's good. Great. I'm seeing questions coming in. Thank you. But I want to ask this one. This is an interesting one, not really enterprise related. So this one, we know that the CEO of Tron recently had they won the lunch with Warren Buffett, right? And Warren Buffett, his companies, are also a lot of enterprises as well. Do you think what do you think for someone, because if you think of it, Warren is the ultimate enterprise from the other side, and he thinks that all this stuff that we're doing in blockchain is crap, okay? Is not working, it will go to zero. If you encounter someone that talks like that, what's the main response that you have when enterprises are so skeptical? What will be a tactic or strategy going around that?
Well, I mean, the first step is to acknowledge the very it's very reasonable to have that doubt, right? Because quite frankly, the previous 2 years, the market have been dominated by scammers and speculators, right? So it's unsurprising that someone looking from the outside would think that this space is not really of any use, right? So that is something we need to acknowledge. Someone like I've not studied everything Warren Buffett said, but I know that he doesn't like cryptocurrencies. Blockchain is a lot more than just a currency, like we talked about before. It has lots of utilities, right? So, Interaxa, we were looking at a lot of these IoT data anchoring functionalities that don't really require any sort of currency. There are, use cases where, you have devices issuing assets. Maybe that's a currency, maybe it's not. But currency is not just not the only use case. And it's perfectly fine if you don't like currency. Lots of people think that it's not backed by anything, there's no military or gold behind it or whatever. That's a valid perspective, right? But at the same time, they're sort of missing out on the fact that blockchain technology has functionalities far beyond just currency.
I think that we can add to that when you start a discussion or a business discussion around buzzwords, blockchain, AI, whatever, then you miss the whole point, right? So when we are having sort of a discussion about a proposal or a project, we try to sell a blockchain solution. without talking about the blockchain, or without even mentioning the name blockchain, right? We are trying to find what's the problem, right? Is it immutability? Is it reconciliation? So we really find the problem, and then we say, okay, so we will build system to solve this problem, regardless of the technology behind it, which most probably will be the blockchain based, right?
So okay, this is great. So does it mean that, for example, when you talk to the enterprise, you know the problem statement, what they want to solve, and the solution without blockchain is better, you will tell the client and we move ahead from that direction, right?
Definitely, yes. And the reason is, because if not, you'll build a POC, you'll spend 6 months, or even the project, and after 6 months, nobody will use it, right? So that's the...
Good. Okay. All right, so there's a few questions here. Do corporate innovation arms help make things easier when penetrating enterprises? What is your experience working with them? I guess the question is asking that if the enterprise themselves may have an innovation arm, is that easier to talk to get to the right decision makers, or what's your experience?
Yeah, I think it's very, sorry.
Yeah, we met a few of those guys also, and sometimes they come from the company and been around for 10, 25 years, and of course people are different. Some of them are very gung-ho on new, curious technologies. Others are saying, well, I don't really think this innovation department is going to change much because we're already doing everything correct, and maybe the person is right. But what we have seen is, and a little bit back to the previous question, we have seen larger corporates actually buying up startups just to get the knowledge in-house, just to see what's going on, just to follow. But what is going on the bigger lines, I think, is what the Singapore government has started with Trade Trust, because that is a blockchain project for sure. And it comes on the back of NTP trade platform, right? So that's somewhere, and if I were Buffett, I would probably do both. Even if I don't like it, I think Stephen is right, he would like it. There's many things he doesn't like. But then look at the Singapore government, other governments, what are they doing? And then maybe just have a small team in-house to see what's going on.
Yeah, I think that those innovation hubs can help startup to bridge the gap between the startup and the enterprise. And it always helps, right? Because they are running after the technology and they know the business use case that's required in the enterprise.
Good. I like this question, but I'm going to rephrase it to give context. So in our own blockchain industry, crypto, blockchain, whatever you call it, we know our industry has a lot of scammers. And pretty sure that the enterprise also know there are a lot. How do we, as with your experience, how do we get enterprises to distinguish who to work with? How do they know that you are not one of the scammers? What's a good way moving forward with this?
We can just quickly mention Warren Buffett again, right? I mean, the news this week was he was defrauded of $300 million on some solar panel stuff that I don't know much about, but it's everywhere. So I think it's whether it's blockchain or it's food stuff or other services. It's a valuation cost benefit, as Stephen mentioned earlier.
I mean, that's the reason why associations like Assaf, we are coming up with frameworks, code of practice, working with regulators and the ecosystem to actually identify the points to actually refer to and to actually have role models and companies that are, in the legitimate space. So I think that is actually important from the association point of view because it's more agnostic as well.
So a little bit of promotion for the association. We have a code of practice to help crypto blockchain companies get bank accounts. So definitely following the code, which we are working with ABS association banks closely, would definitely help out on that. Yeah. So, but it also doesn't just to your point. If we say that to the enterprise, saying that there's a lot of scams out there and stuff, you just have to watch for yourself. That I don't. Would you be using that to talk to the enterprise, or is there a way to actually talk to them when they say? How to make them convinced that you're not a scam? Do you get it? Like when you are a new company, okay, there's two things now we have to deal with in our industry. One, they can trust you. Two, you're not a scam. If without the second part, it's fine. So what is it what are the steps forward to move with the enterprise so that they can be more convinced that you're legitimate to work with. Even though, let's say, yes, you're in an association and following a code, but what are the soft steps that you try to push to make sure they believe you that you're not one of them?
So I think as any case, reference is the best evidence, right? If you have like really good reference, this is one thing. The second thing is if you can provide some fast POC or demo that you can demonstrate your platform, so they will see that you have something and you are not just like telling some stories around what you have.
References. Okay, this one's good. Okay. Okay, what these a lot of okay, good questions. Okay, so this one is asking, how do you see? I'm also rephrasing this because I just want to push it for the enterprise context. When you talk to enterprises, when they want a blockchain, when a blockchain solution actually suits, is it still mostly on a private blockchain that they think should move forward with, or they are starting to be more open to have something that is public, be more transparent? So, or they not in terms of education, they're still not at that step to decide which one. What's your experience when talking to them?
So for us, we are part of Anson Group, and Anson Group actually has Zilliqa as well, which Zilliqa is a public blockchain. So there are cases where customer come in and started the discussion, and then we realized that actually he's talking about public blockchain, and then we move it to the other company. So I mean, it's again, it's the same answer to the question about if the project is not a blockchain project, would you do that? So I mean, if you are really startup that believe in what you are doing, you need to just focus on what you are doing and not just focus on every customer that wants to do something and to pay you some amount of dollars.
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot has been talked about, right, with private chains for permission ledgers versus public chains. I think fundamentally blockchain is really there to bridge trust gaps, right? And how decentralized a system is depends on how much distrust there is in a specific system, right? If you truly distrust, if there's tons of distrust in the ecosystem that you're working with, then yeah, maybe a public ledger is what you need. That's the level of security and decentralization and collusion resistance that you need. But a lot of times, enterprises, they work in relatively close ecosystems. They have fixed number of partners that they've worked with for a very long time. It's not that they don't trust them. It's just that maybe the cost of validation and data integrity, provenance, all these issues are really high right now. And hey, having a permission blockchain system helps them to reduce costs, right? They would not be working with these partners if they hugely distrust them. So, and once again, right, it depends on, it's all about solving the problem and not sort of pushing a specific agenda or ideology onto the customer.
Okay, so there's this question asking about the blockchain startups encouraging speculation or trading. To me, this is not really for enterprise. So whoever asked that, you can ask me off stage. I'll help you answer that one. Okay, but this one is good. So why should you decide for the enterprises whether the POC makes sense? Shouldn't they make their own decisions and mistakes? Or I think that a better way to ask would be, are the startups actually going this way to tell them to do a POC with your experience, or the enterprise themselves are looking for a POC to do? And what's the experience on that?
So for me, again, I mean, we are not a consultancy company. We are a product house. We build products. So when the enterprise came in with the use case, if it makes sense, you can use our product. But if it doesn't make sense, I mean, you can do the POC. Just choose other vendor to work with.
Oh, okay. So you're saying which is fine, like the business model that you're working with, you still will go to different companies, tell them what you have, and they see if it fits, then we see and try a POC from that way. Okay, that's great. That's good.
And we've seen both, and I would like to add to that, we've also seen, and I'm sure many of you have noticed, we see some people doing a POC, and then not so long time after that, their competitors are also doing a POC, and very often, at least from what I can gather, there are very few details. Was it a bank transaction? Was it an electronic bill of lading? What kind of information was in it? Because I'm talking about shipping and logistics and supply chain. It's very hard to see the details, but yet the big companies are mentioning in press releases that they've done a POC for blockchain solutions in the transport space, but it's hard to see what the details have been.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we've noticed that is for brand new technologies, right? And this is sort of maybe just my personal experience is that for brand new technologies, it almost feels like every single tech startup in the space needs to act a little like a consulting company, right? Because I think whether or not something makes sense, it's going to be sort of the best way to do it is a co-creation process, right? You work with, this is just like what Daphne said, right? You walk into a client and you work with their decision makers to see what does make sense, you ideate, right? While we understand the technology, they understand the industry. I mean, there's a clear knowledge gap there. So when the technology is so new and so few people have good understandings of it, it's about the co-creation process. If it makes sense, it makes sense. It doesn't, it doesn't. But it's hard to say, like, whether they tell you or you tell them. Most of the time, I think both sides only have pieces, right? Not the whole picture.
Good. So this segues to the closing part. So basically for enterprise working with startups will be the trend moving forward, because we definitely want the can say the incumbents or the existing industry to be using blockchain, and then we can have the whole ecosystem flourish even more. But how do you think going forward, what the trends will be like going forward for the relationship between a startup and an enterprise?
I would just like to open that last comments. I guess everybody has just as quickly the phases we've seen is we've seen these startups perhaps again in the supply chain space acting as the canary in a coal mine, where many of them have been called because there was actually gas leakages, right? That was the whole point. Now we see more tie-ups, and we do see big enterprises buying up smaller shops. We also see some of the big developing houses like IBM actually outsourcing a lot of their things. So yes, it will be interesting to follow, but the trend will be, of course, consolidation. Yeah.
Anyone see like different sort of trends? Consultation seems to be definitely one, because we need to educate. But do you think that if we do need to compare consultation and acquisition, do you think acquisition will be a growing trend, or still a partnership? You still see that sort of trend flourishing?
Yeah, I think acquisition would be the trend because it's actually faster with the maturity of the startup companies going through a 2 to 3 year kind of phase, having different use cases. So yeah, but in terms of collaboration and tie-ups between startups and enterprises, I think fundamentally it will not change too much. It's not just for blockchain, but it's actually across all types of startup kind of propositions. Yeah.
Great. So we've discussed quite a lot the trends, the regulations, and all of that. We can see that well, at least even I'm quite convinced that the enterprise startup relationship model will definitely continue. So that closes off this panel. Can you please give me a round of applause for the panelists here? Thank you very much.